Hi everyone, how you doing? We're on to the next week. This week's topic, we're going to talk about sheep harvest and processing. So I'm hoping you're watching this video prior to the glass ceilings or walls or whatever that video is, because it'll help you understand it more. Anyway, so let's talk about sheep harvest, which is basically a nice way of saying, butchering, in case you didn't catch that. Okay, so next thing. Oh, there we go. So in a processing plant, just whether it's chickens or sheep, the first thing that we have to do is we have to do an ante-mortem inspection. So ante means before, mortem means death. So in a sheep slaughter plant, like if we had the chance to go to Superior, this is usually the lecture I give before we go to Superior to tour the plant. Um, it is an inspection that's done prior to sending the animals to slaughter. And it is really important in sheep because of one particular disease, which I am sure you can imagine what that disease is. But what we do with the ante-mortem inspection is the USDA inspector will go out and look at the sheep either as they're unloaded or when they're in the pens prior to slaughter, making sure that the animals are healthy. They're not sick. They don't have any clinical signs of illness. And one particular disease they're looking for, of course, is the disease scrapie, which we talked about in class already. So that is the neurological disorder. So they're looking for sheep that, are showing neurological signs like circling or other weird behaviors. But anyway, that's all done before the animals are even close to becoming food. Then the next part, which is oftentimes hard for people to watch, and I understand totally, it's not a bad thing. But I will tell you that all stunning and killing in the United States is monitored very carefully. And the tools that are used are high tech, and the animal is rendered senseless before it is actually, killed for food. So the interesting thing about sheep is they're gregarious animals, and we usually use a bellwether, which you may have heard that term before. It's actually a sheep with a bell around its neck. It's not always a wether, but that's the old saying. And they will lead the sheep up to the kill area, which is basically a big alleyway. And it's kind of interesting because the wether goes in front and he'll go up and he'll get to a certain point and they have a little gate that he can go out, and he knows how to go out there because he gets a little treat when he goes out there. And then the rest of the sheep go up on into a conveyor belt type system, one at a time. The animals go into the kill area where they are stunned electrically with it's a big device that has to run properly and is checked all the time to make sure the animal is stunned properly. And then the throat is cut of the lamb, and that allows the animal to bleed out. You want the animal to be bled out because blood is a source of bacterial growth. So we don't want any blood residue inside animal carcass that's going to be used for food. Once they go in after they're killed, the first thing we have to do is take off their hide, or in sheep we call it a pelt. And they have an amazing device that actually pulls the hide off the sheep. And remember, it's completely dead. It's not twitching or moving or anything. The animal is gone. It's gone up to heaven. It's gone. Its spirit is gone. And the hide puller pulls the hide off. And then they have a guy that cuts the head off, and the feet are removed at that time. The head is kept because the head basically has to stay with the carcass because they inspect the head for any abnormalities or anything that could later on go on to affect the carcass. And then after the hide is removed, you basically have a big carcass hanging there. And so we eviscerate. Evisceration is the removal of the internal organs. At that point, you have a USDA inspecting the animal to make sure the animal doesn't have any signs of illness in its bodily organs. So we're always looking for the liver. They looked at the lungs. They look at the general condition of the body. And at that time, almost everything in a sheep carcass is used by some aspect of the food or the byproduct industry. So we separate out edible and marketable byproducts. Byproducts could be the tongue, the intestines, which are used for sausage casings, the brain, eyes are used for scientific research. The feet are used for dog treats. The liver, that's human food. The kidneys. There's so many byproducts in sheep. Like I said, nothing is wasted. And all of this happens as the animal goes down the line and is gradually moves down the line. One thing that is an issue is sheep heads used to be more of a problem to dispose. I think they have that figured out now. And that has to do with disease scrapie, because the brain is where the scrapie prion, the disease-causing organism, lives. But I think that that problem has been solved. Moving on. So after the animal is eviscerated, it's now a carcass, and what's left are the cuttable, edible cuts of meat. And so what we're looking for is now the animal will be graded. Once it's been inspected, it's graded. And so the first thing we do is a yield grade. And the yield grade is how much meat the carcass will yield. So cuttability, my head's in the way there. Cuttability is that designation of the yield grade. So yield grade 1 is an animal that's very thin, almost too thin. Yield grade 2s are the most desirable, 2s and 3s. When we get to a yield grade 5, that's a very fat animal. And fat is wasteful because we don't eat fat. You don't like to eat fat when you eat meat, and that has to be trimmed out. And it's very expensive to raise lambs and then have to trim off a huge amount of fat. So those lambs are very undesirable. Even the 4s are undesirable. So cuttability is the percent of carcass weight represented by the closely trimmed cuts. So, come on. So if we look at the cuttability, so yield grade 1 will yield about 51% of its carcass in trimmed retail cuts. So if you take, let's just make an easy one, let's take a 100-pound lamb. You will get 51%, which would be 51 pounds of retail cuts. And so that is what a lamb processor would like. The problem with a 1 is that it doesn't have enough shelf life. There isn't enough fat to make the meat taste good. So this is a very thin lamb. That is not good. However, the 2s and the 3s are the yield grade that we are looking at most desirably. So roughly the yield grade and yield on sheep is about 50%. So half of the carcass is meat and edible cuts of meat. A yield grade 5, you can see, has only 45 pounds. For a 100-pound lamb, which is very small, but it's easy to do the math, a 100-pound lamb would have only 45 pounds of retail cuts. So cuttability is the amount of trimmed, lean retail cuts that can be sold from that carcass. It's very important from a processing standpoint. Quality grade refers to the eating quality of the animal. The eating quality of the animal in sheep is very easy compared to beef. In beef cattle, we have, much more variation in quality. For the quality grades in the United States, we start by designating them kind of by age. So lamb, remember this, is anything under a year of age. Yearling mutton is between 12 months to 24 months, and mutton is basically meat from an old sheep. The way that in the United States, the way that we determine if a lamb is a lamb, when we cut the carcass and we take the feet off the carcass, right where the pastern is, if that joint breaks, that's called the break joint, and that indicates that this bone has not calcified or ossified. And so that evidence of the break joint means that that is a lamb. And that is how we determine the difference between lamb and mutton in the United States. In Europe and in Mexico, they look at the head. That's why we have to keep the head with the animal, because they look at the teeth to determine if it is a lamb, or if it has its yearling teeth and it's not a lamb anymore. But in the US, we're looking for this break joint. If it has a spool joint, that means this area has calcified and the animal is no longer young. If it has a spool joint, then it is considered to be mutton. So in quality grades, remember, this has to do with the eating quality, nothing to do with the yield of carcass cuts, but the eating quality. There's 4 quality grades in lamb. There's prime, choice, good, and utility. About 90% of all lambs grade choice. So if I ask you that on the test, 90% grade choice. That is the most common grade of quality grade for lamb. And that is a very desirable grade. Prime, those yield grade 4s and 5s are your prime lambs. And they are not efficient to raise because they're too fat. So they go to high-end restaurants, but you will never see prime lamb in a grocery store, even Costco. The good and utility are usually what we call no roll. The carcass isn't rolled with the grade. So they will go to industrial establishments. They will go to low-end big box grocery stores where the quality of meat is just a little bit poor. These qualities are still, the good quality is still good, plenty good to eat. So the way that we determine quality grade is by the maturity of the animal. It has to be a lamb, the lean quality, and conformation. But like I said, most all lambs in the United States grade choice. Okay, so maturity is the color of the meat, the how much calcification there is. And a younger animal, of course, is more tender and the meat is milder in flavor. So that is important in eating quality. And then the lean quality, remember, really only beef cattle marble. Sheep do not put marbling or fat specks inside the muscle, only beef do, but they look for some degree of fatness, and then they have to have good conformation and muscling. They can't look like a like a dairy goat. So if we go to the wholesale cuts, I'm going to have you do an assignment on this because I have very crappy pictures here. So the wholesale cuts are the big cuts. So these would be what you would send to a butcher shop or to a restaurant. So the wholesale cuts are given here, and you can kind of see my picture's kind of blurry. But really anything in the front end of the animal is much lower quality, more connective tissue, more cartilage, just a little bit lower quality. Anything from the back, the rack, the loin, and the leg, those are your high-end wholesale cuts. And the rack, the loin, and the leg make up the hind saddle of the lamb. Rack, loin, and leg make up the hind saddle, and that is what a lot of restaurants will order, and then they will cut it and cook it the way that they want. The most expensive single wholesale cut on the lamb, of course, is the rack. And if you've shown sheep, you know where that is, and you can look on this lamb here and see where it is. The lower end cuts, of course, would be the shoulder. The breast really is mostly ribs and fat. There's not much meat there. The shank, the neck, those are all pretty low-end cuts. Okay, and then the term retail. A retail cut is when you go to the grocery store and you buy a pack of lamb, a tray pack, where the loin has been cut into loin chops, or you buy a rack of lamb already prepared and ready to cook. So wholesale are the big cuts, and that's what a lot of restaurants or institutions like cruise ships, that's what they would buy, and then they would cut it and prepare it the way they want. Retail means that's what you're getting in a grocery store. Okay, and this, again, I'm going to have you do a little assignment on this because this picture is not very clear, but it shows you the different retail cuts, and it also kind of shows you where they come from. But there is a better picture that we'll get for that. So that's kind of a little overview of lamb processing, and I hope you learned a little bit, and now you can watch that glass ceiling assignment or wall, I can't remember if it's walls or ceiling. Anyway, and maybe have a better understanding about what's going on. All right, okay, I'll see you guys next week. Bye.